Excellent. I'd like to welcome my great and learned friend, Dr. Eyal Meiron, who is a well-known historian here in Israel. His field of speciality is the land of Israel and beyond. He's a lecturer both at Bar-Ilan University and the Ben Zvi Institute. So thank you once more, Eyal, for joining us this evening. And I think we should start by giving a sort of a bit of an overview with regard to the history of Jerusalem, its importance, and how we shall explore and probe how does it fit in the Palestinian narrative. So over to you, if you'd like to
Thank you very much, Marco. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Dr. Fogarello, for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be able to participate in this webinar regarding the significance of Jerusalem in the, as you said, the Palestinian narrative. I would actually broaden up the title. It's actually the Islamic narrative, because when we speak about Palestinians in this respect, in the Holy Land, we mainly refer to the Muslim Palestinians. There are other Palestinians, Christian Palestinians, but the issue here is actually the Islamic group in this country calling itself Palestinians. So they are Muslims, and before we go to that, allow me, as per your request, Marco, to elaborate a little bit on the history of Jerusalem. It will be very brief, obviously, due to the time limitations. Sorry, and I apologize to those who have more than basic information about the topic. I'm addressing the general population here, and some of you know more than the others, some know less, which is absolutely fine. So I'd like to just give you the a brief sketch of the importance of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a city that was established almost 4,000 years ago, along with many cities in the Holy Land. It was a Canaanite, pagan city in biblical times. But the first time in its history, its long history, that Jerusalem became a holy city and a capital of any nation was in the time of David and Solomon. And that's the beginning of the First Temple period. For the first time in its history, Jerusalem became a capital of any nation. Obviously, we're talking about the Jewish nation, the Israelites. And for the first time in its history, as far as we know, it became a holy city because David brought to Jerusalem the Ark of the Covenant, in which, as you all probably know, according to the Bible, there were the tablets of Moses, the 10 Commandments, and so on and so forth. So this is basically the beginning, the core of everything. Jerusalem was the capital of the Jews in the First Temple period. Then the First Temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then the Jews were exiled. But a couple of decades later, the Jews returned from their exile, and that is the first return to Zion. Zion is another name given to Jerusalem and the land of Israel. And the Jews established or began the Second Temple period, in which Jerusalem again, for a certain period of time, became a capital again of the Jews, and of course, the holy city, and that's never changed. After the Second Temple period, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, and the temple was destroyed. The Jewish people during the next couple of centuries went to exile. Some of them were taken as captives and taken abroad. Others left the country due to the oppression of the nations that occupied the Holy Land. I'm talking about the Byzantines, Romans, Byzantines later, the Muslims later, the Crusaders later, other types of Muslims. I'm not going to go into the details, but this country's history involves a continuous situation of occupation by others, by non-Jews. And during the non-Jewish occupation of the country, for instance, during the Muslim occupation, Jerusalem was never a capital. Even though the Muslims, or the Byzantines for that matter, had all the opportunity to turn Jerusalem into a capital of any empire, it never was a capital of any other nation, apart from a very short period of time, 800 years ago, when the land of Israel, Jerusalem, were held by the Crusaders, Christians from Europe, and they indeed turned Jerusalem into their capital for about 100 years. But that is the exception. The rule is that Jerusalem is never a capital of any nation in history, apart from the Jewish periods. So it's the first temple period, second temple period, and finally, the last time is in the 20th century, when the Jewish state of Israel was formed in 1948, and a year later, Jerusalem was declared its capital. Throughout its 3,000 years of history, Jerusalem is the most holy site for the Jews, for obvious reasons, such as the existence of the temples in Jerusalem, such as the tradition about the binding of Isaac in the time of Abraham on Mount Moriah, according to the Bible in the book of Genesis, and many other traditions. So Jerusalem is always the most holy site. Some perhaps would even care to say the only holy site, really holy site in Judaism. It is not the case with regards to the Islamic tradition. Islam, for those of you who are not versed with this topic, was born 1,300 years ago, not in Jerusalem, not in the Holy Land. Now, this is crucial to note, that the land of Israel and later Jerusalem is the birthplace of two monotheistic religions: Judaism, Abraham, Jacob, David, and the First Temple period, and Christianity, Jesus, Nazareth, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and so on. So the story of Christianity and the story of Judaism are connected, linked with the story of the Holy Land, and especially with Jerusalem. This is not the case, Marco, with Islam, because Islam was imported to the Holy Land. Islam was imported because Islam was born in the Arabian Peninsula. It's a huge peninsula, a mostly desert, south and southeast of the Holy Land. Today there are several states over there, Saudi Arabia and the Yemen, and they're all in the so-called Arabian Peninsula. This is the birthplace of Islam. So the question that we need to ask, I believe, is how come that Jerusalem became a holy city in Islam? It's obvious in the case of Judaism and Christianity, there's no question. Why would nomads, Bedouins, from a faraway place in the Arabian Peninsula would choose Jerusalem as the holy site, as one of their holy sites? And allow me, before we continue, Marco, and I'll let you
no, that's
interrupt
fine.
in a moment. One should also note the fact that in Islam, the official policy towards Jerusalem is that Jerusalem is the third holy site. It's not, as in Judaism, the only or the first, it's only the third holy site. There are two holier places in the Arabian Peninsula where Islam was born 1,300 years ago. One of them is the city of Mecca, and the other one is the city of Medina. For historical reasons, this is not a discussion of the history of Islam, so I will not go into details. Forgive me for that, but that should suffice. So Jerusalem is the third holy site for Muslims. Now, when I say that, I also need to perhaps fine-tune what I just said. Islam is not one body. Actually, there are two large sections in Islam. The bigger section, they're called the Sunnis, and they're most of the Muslims that you know. The smaller section, the minority, is called Shiites. Now, when I say minority, we're talking about 250 million people. That's the minority. It gives you the sense of how big the Muslim faith is. But the point is that for the Sunnis, it is true that Jerusalem is the third important and third holy site in their religious understanding. But for the Shiites, who are different, they're also Muslims, it's a bit different. Jerusalem is not even the third, not perhaps even the fourth or the fifth. There are many other holier sites in the Islamic world.
Indeed, indeed. Now, why indeed does it become important? I'd like us to deal with this matter because, as you and I know, perhaps the people who are listening to us don't know that the only capital of an Arabic Muslim entity here was the city of Ramla. Okay, not far from Jerusalem, but it never was Jerusalem. So, why does it become such an important city in Islam, and when?
Okay, so basically the story goes back to the beginning of Islam. It's quite old, and it goes back to the prophet of Islam, whose name is Muhammad. 1,300 years ago, Muhammad, in the 5th, 7th century, declared himself a prophet. He claimed that he speaks with God. The name of God in Islam is Allah. So he speaks with Allah, and he gave him the holy book, and he established a new religion based on that book known as the Quran. So these are basically revelations, divine revelations revealed to the prophet. And Muhammad was persecuted by the pagans in the Arabian Peninsula. Before the rise of Islam, there were Christians in the Arabian Peninsula. There were many Jews living in the Arabian Peninsula. They were exterminated by Muhammad, by the early Muslims, by the way. And there are also pagans. The majority are pagans. Yes. And they control the holy city of Mecca. So Muhammad, who lives in Mecca, is persecuted by the elite, by the old pagan regime in Mecca.
The establishment.
The establishment, yes, the old money, the old establishment, and they persecute him, and therefore he decides to go somewhere else. This is the famous hijrah. He fled from Mecca to a neighboring city called Medina. And in Medina, there were 3 Jewish tribes. And this is a key point, you see, because we need to understand that Islam indeed was formed far away from the Holy Land, far away from Jerusalem. This is not to say that Islam did not know about Judaism and Christianity. Muhammad himself was a traveling agent. He accompanied caravans along the Arabian Peninsula. He met with many Jews, rabbis, Christian priests. He listened, he learned, and as a result, many of the concepts, of the ideas that came from Judaism and Islam, such as the importance of Jerusalem, were embedded by Muhammad into his own new religion. So Islam may be seen, if you like, as a third floor, which is built by Muhammad on top of the shoulders, if you like, of Christianity,
yes,
and Judaism. And the proof to that is very simple. All you need to do is open the holy book of the Quran, and you will clearly see that it mentions David, it mentions the temple, it mentions Jesus, it mentions Mary. We see the biblical stories come to life within the Quran.
Indeed.
How did it happen? Well, obviously, this is a clear influence of the old religions. Right. Jerusalem's importance was embedded within the old religions, within Christianity and Judaism, and therefore this is the first component in the holiness of Jerusalem in the Quran.
Mm-hmm. Let me just interject a second now. With regards to its sanctity, though, we have to move a little bit forward in time.
Yes.
It hasn't got that sanctity with the Muslim invasion in 638. When does that come about? When is it rendered in some form, some shape or form, a holy city?
Well, in a sense, according to the Islamic understanding, it already happened during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. I'll just give you an example to that. When Muhammad traveled to Medina, when he fled from Mecca, he met with the Jews, and he wrongly believed, of course, that was not true, that they will be willing to accept him as a prophet. The Jews refused to. So he tried to persuade them that the new religion is quite similar to Judaism, to the old one. How to do that? Well, he told the Jews that they should pray 5 times a day. And when they asked him to which direction, he said, what a question. To Jerusalem, of course. So Jerusalem is the first direction of prayer to Islam. Does that show that Jerusalem was a holy city for Muhammad? Well, Muslims would tell you that this is indeed the case. From an academic point of view, and I represent here the academic point of view, it only shows that Muhammad was a clever politician who knew that in order to recruit the Jews, he should give them something. He should show them that Jerusalem is also important to him. So I think that what stood behind that is actually a political motive. But when we move forward in time, as you suggested, Marco, things become clearer. Again, in the 7th century, quite early in the birth of Islam, right after the time of the Prophet, the Prophet is already dead. Muhammad is no longer with us, and there are caliphs. The caliphs are the rulers of the Islamic world, and they established an empire, okay, which stretches all over the Middle East, just to simplify things. At some point, at some point in the 7th century, a dynasty is established not far from the land of Israel, not far from Jerusalem, in Syria, our northern neighbor today.
Yes.
And the capital of this dynasty, they're known as the Umayyads, is in Syria, in Damascus. And they have a strong hold over the western regions where we are at the moment in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is like a shining diamond, a holy city next to the capital, next to Damascus. So they try, for political reasons, to establish the sanctity of Jerusalem. Some even speculate that maybe they had a vague idea of transferring the capital to Jerusalem. I don't think there's any real evidence for that, but they build a lot in Jerusalem. They rebuild the Temple Mount and build Muslim structures on it. And of course, they need to show the Muslims that Jerusalem is holy for them too. So in those days, we find a legend which is presented by the Umayyad scholars, according to which the Prophet Muhammad many decades earlier, was taken by the angel Gabriel from Mecca to a place called Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, the furthest mosque.
Indeed.
And from there, he ascended to heaven, received the commandments, and then went back home. Where is that place which is the connection between heaven and earth? According to the Umayyad scholars, it is Jerusalem. Now, that story is hinted at the Quran, but it doesn't mention Jerusalem. So
Indeed.
There were many scholars who disagreed with that.
Indeed, indeed. Let me just stop you there.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
while they try to acquire sanctity for it within the Islamic faith, okay, nonetheless, they never denied the Jewish connection to it. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, yes and no. And the no is a big no, which appears in the 20th century.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm getting at.
Yes.
In the early years of Islam, they even minted coins whereby the menorah is portrayed on the face of the coin. So we have a direct, even if you will, an unwitting testimony to the existence, to the Jewish presence on the part of Muslims, that is.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And even beyond that, you're absolutely right about the menorah, which is the most identified Jewish symbol, which suddenly appears on early Islamic coins. But also think about the name of Jerusalem in early Islam. The name of Jerusalem, as it is called by early Muslims, it had several names, but one of the most prominent names is, and I'll say it in Arabic, the language of the Muslims, the language of the Quran. They called it Bayt al-Maqdis.
Exactly.
Bayt al-Maqdis, for those of you who perhaps speak Hebrew or heard Hebrew, Bayt al-Maqdis is exactly Beit HaMikdash in Hebrew, the house of the temple, literally, the Temple Mount. That's the name of Jerusalem. Another name is Al-Quds, the Holy One.
Exactly.
Yes, that is indeed in the beginning.
Yeah.
And even until the 20th century, in an official guide written by the Muslim authorities in 1924, published in Arabic and English, it is clearly said that the Jewish temple, used to stand on the Temple Mount. No one disputes that.
Exactly.
However, today things are different due to the conflict between the Muslims, and I intentionally stress Muslims because it is a religious issue, and the Israelis, i.e. Jewish Israelis. Due to that conflict, in recent decades, many Muslims claim, even in Islamic universities, that the Jewish temple never stood on the Temple Mount, that this is a lie promoted by the Israelis. This is, of course, totally unbased historically, and the Muslim sources themselves contradict that. But that's a tool in the political conflict.
Indeed, indeed. And that's very much the scope of our conversation this evening, how this change came about when we talk about Palestinian narrative. Okay. Would you care to explain to our viewers the origin of the word Palestinian so we can get a better idea of the mechanisms which have come into place?
Yes, definitely. Perhaps I'll refer first to the term Palestine, where it came from, and then we'll continue to the question of who are the Palestinians, because this is an interesting, informative issue that we need to address. But firstly, the name Palestine. Well, originally, the term Palestine, Palestina, appears in the 5th century BC. That's the time of the Greeks, in the writings of a Greek historian named Herodotus. He refers to the southwestern area of the Holy Land of Israel today, the southwestern western coastal plain. And this is known as Palestina because, according to the Bible, this is where the Philistines used to live. So the term Palestina is a geographical term referring not to the land of Israel, not to the Holy Land in its entirety. One should be clear about that. It only refers to a tiny fraction of the southern part of the Holy Land, according to the Greeks. It's a pagan term, and it refers to the Philistines, who since then totally disappeared. There are no Philistines any longer. Okay?
Indeed.
Now,
Indeed.
Later, that term reappeared in the 2nd century AD, in the time of Emperor Hadrian. This is the time of the Roman occupation after the destruction of the Second Temple, and the Jews rebelled against the Romans, and the rebellion was crushed. That happens in the time of Emperor Hadrian. And Emperor Hadrian realizes that the rebellions, the constant rebellions of the Jews, are motivated by the spirituality of Judaism, by the connection to the Holy Land, by the connection to Jerusalem. And he tries to sever that connection.
I would say its centrality even. Without Jerusalem, things unhinge pretty rapidly in Judaism.
I agree. Its centrality, definitely. Even though Jerusalem is no longer a Jewish city, it's under Roman occupation, yet it is still at the focal point of the Jewish mind ever since. So he decides to do 3 things. Firstly, he rebuilds Jerusalem as a pagan city with typical design of a Roman pagan city. Next, he renamed Jerusalem. He gave it a new name. He called it Ilia Capitolina. It's a Roman name, named after the Capitoline gods in Rome. And he also altered the name of the region, which was known then as Judea. Comes from the word Jews, the tribe of Judah.
Exactly.
So he altered that, and he renamed it Palestina after the Philistines. So he's the first to take the insignificant geographical term and turn it into a title of a political entity for the first time in history. Mind you, even he did not name the entire country Palestina. It's just a central part known as Judea by the Romans. So Indeed. This is the first appearance of the term as a political term in history.
Exactly. Now, let's try and run through the different regimes and power structures that existed up to 1948, and look at delve into the ethnic composition of the land itself. How would you do that? Let's say from the late Roman period up until the period of the British Mandate, very briefly.
Yes.
Let's try and get an outline. Let's see if we can convey this to our listeners.
I will do that, but perhaps I will focus on the issue of the so-called Palestinians in order to expose the actual process that led to the present situation. So basically, this country was continuously occupied and reoccupied by different nations. Starting with the end of the Second Temple period, we have the Romans and then the Byzantines, who are basically Romans who were Christianized, and then come the Muslims, and then come the Crusaders, who are Europeans for just 200 years, that's it, and then the Muslims come back. And that's the situation until the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, when the country was taken over by the Europeans, again, by the British Army in World War I.
Exactly.
But when we focus on the Arabs or the Muslims, to be precise, let's stick to the Islamic term because it will keep us focused. So the people who are called Palestinians today, who call themselves Palestinians today, are basically composed of three different groups. One group is the original invaders. They are the occupiers of this land, and they took over this land in 638. Jerusalem was occupied by the Muslims in 638. Muslims came from the Arabian Peninsula and settled in different places. So that's one group that remains still today. Another group, we assume, that's reasonable, is the original population of this land. Think about the Jews who remained in this country. Think about Christians. Many of them, in a process, a very long process that took hundreds of years, many of them simply realized it's best for them to become Muslims. So they converted. So some of the present-day Muslim population is actually a converted Jewish and Christian population, local population. And the last group, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of people, are migrant workers. These are people who migrated from Egypt, Syria, Algeria, Lebanon, Jordan, the Sinai region. All these territories are outside the land of Israel, and they migrated into the land of Israel in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. All of these together, you see, it's a mixture. We don't speak about a nation here. It's a mishmash of different ethnic origins and tribes and chamulas, large families,
clans,
clans who actually don't even mix together.
That's
Some
right.
of the animosity within the local Islamic population here in Israel today is explained by this understanding, by the fact that they belong to different tribes, clans, families, and they still today, even still today, they fight each other. So there's great animosity within the so-called Palestinian society.
Indeed, indeed. Let's get back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, if I recall correctly, in the early part of the 19th century already had a Jewish majority. Can you confirm that?
Well, almost the beginning. At the first half of the 19th century, definitely.
Yes. Yeah.
Let me say that. In Jerusalem in 1839, we have a population of around 10,000 people. The majority is Jewish. It's the largest community. There are Christians, there are Muslims, there are Jews. The Jews are the largest community. That's in 1839.
That's right.
In 1870, just one
sorry, go
small
ahead.
detail. No, it's fine. In 1870, the population of Jerusalem is 20,000 people, and 11,000 are Jewish. That is, the Jews in 1870 are the largest community, and they are even bigger than the rest of the communities combined. That happens a long time ago.
Right. And that indeed is unwitting testimony to the fact of Jerusalem's centrality to Judaism.
It is definitely. I'd like to remind all of us that there was a constant Jewish presence in the Holy Land and almost continuous Jewish presence in Jerusalem during the last 3,000 years. In times, there were no Jews living in Jerusalem, not because Jews did not want to be in Jerusalem, because they were not allowed to. For instance, the Crusaders slaughtered the Jewish population in the year 1099, and they did not allow the Jews to live in the city, apart from a very small number, 4 Jews or maybe more than that, during the 12th century. So that is an exception. But as a rule, there's always a Jewish presence in Jerusalem because Jerusalem is so central for the Jews. Every Jew, every day, when he prays, mentions Jerusalem in his prayers. Quite. It is a living memory. It is a living place in the mind of every Jew for the last a couple of thousands of years.
Indeed, indeed. So let's go back to the question of Palestinian claims to Jerusalem and their desire to have it as its capital of a Palestinian state. I note with interest that when you describe the timeline from the ancient period, there had never in history been a Palestinian state.
Not only there's never been a Palestinian state, there has never been a Palestinian identity. Indeed. Until the last years of the 19th century, where we find the first roots of that idea, and mostly in the 1920s, 1930s, and certainly after the birth of the State of Israel. It is more a reaction to the large growing numbers of Jews coming to the Holy Land, returning to their homeland. In the 19th century, people here, and we have evidence for that. We can read what Muslims in the Holy Land write in the 19th century, what they write in the 20th century. They speak about themselves, not as Palestinians. That term wasn't even born back then. They think about themselves as South Syrians.
Indeed,
they belong to Syria, not to. They're not in an independent they do not have an independent identity. There's no independent nation at that time. All that is a creation of much more later times. That is in the 20th century.
Indeed. So we can't really speak of an ethnogenesis as we understand it with other people.
Certainly not. Certainly not. Of course, today people, well, it's accepted by many that people can determine themselves. They can decide who they are. But looking at it from a historical point of view, I'm referring to that only. I'm not saying that people are not allowed to determine who they are, but historically speaking, no, there were no Palestinians. People didn't think about themselves in these terms until quite recently. And the reason that began is, as I said earlier, because of the rise of Jewish nationality, of the Israeli state, the Six-Day War, and on and on. So I believe it would be best explained as a reactive rather than something that grew out of an imminent need to determine yourself as
yes, it certainly wasn't an organic process of people with a similar culture coming together and acquiring national consciousness as we understand it in the case of the British or other ethnicities. I think we can safely rule that out.
I do believe so, yes, because you see, when one tries to define the Jewish culture in general, one can find many clear indications for a distinct identity. When we speak about Islam in general, obviously we can find lots of traits and definitions and indications for a unified identity. Indeed. But when we speak about people in this country, in the Holy Land, in the land of Israel, Muslims here, I wonder, do they have any clear characteristics that define them as a distinctive culture? Indigenous distinctive culture of the Holy Land? I don't think so. Whatever we see here, we see all around the Middle East. Falafel, yeah, they have a better falafel in Egypt. I was there last year, and I
Indeed.
enjoyed it much better. So I think that indeed the idea of a Palestinian identity is a very late creation in the history of the Holy Land, and it is mostly motivated, I believe, by political reasons and the conflict with Israel. I'm not the only one saying that. When you listen and you read what Palestinian speakers sometimes say when they're perhaps not that careful, such as what Professor Edward Said, one of most the vocal representatives of the Palestinian interests, they admit that the idea of a Palestinian entity was born in an attempt, as part of an attempt, to eradicate the Jewish presence and the Jewish state in the land of Israel.
Indeed,
So,
indeed. As far as even in the period of the British Mandate and subsequent to the partition plan, there was no talk of a Palestinian state in that period. People were speaking of another Arab state.
Indeed, Arab state, indeed. They were talking about an Arab state, not a Palestinian state. The terms, I'll tell you more than that. You see, Marco, in the Mandate period, when people spoke about Palestinians, when the term became more and more widespread, in their terminology, it actually referred to the Arabs and the Jews.
Yeah.
So my grandfather is a Palestinian. That's
Indeed.
how they thought about themselves as people, because the British called the land Palestine.
Indeed.
Historical reasons.
Indeed.
But that's an invented name. And as I said, at the beginning of the 20th century, Jews were Palestinians.
Indeed.
Arabs, when they began to think about themselves as people who live in the country, not as an Arab identity, not as a Muslim identity, they thought about themselves as Palestinians in the sense that they live in the area,
geographic region
British,
called, yes, indeed. So to a great extent, the term Palestine itself reacquires significance during the period of the British Mandate.
Yes, yes, and that's also the period of the rise of the local Muslim nationality.
Indeed,
indeed. Mainly led by one person who was an important agent in this respect. He was the Mufti, the religious leader, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was one of the most important figures to forge what later will be called a Palestinian identity.
Indeed, indeed. He provides the sort of conceptual energy without the name being associated with this phenomenon. Let us, but nonetheless, before we really start speaking of Palestinian people, it only really comes into vogue when most of Judea and Samaria, the current West Bank, is under the control of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, Marco?
The notion of Palestinian doesn't really come into vogue until after Israel acquires the West Bank during the course of the Six-Day War. There was ample opportunity to establish a so-called Palestinian state if that indeed was something that resonated with the population of the West Bank.
I agree. I totally agree. Yes, the Six-Day War was a watershed line in many respects in the history of this land, and one of these respects is, of course, the rise of the demand for a Palestinian state, which never appeared before. We never heard about it before that. Maybe there was some voices immediately after the emergence of the State of Israel. In 1948, that's 19 years earlier. But yes, the watershed line is indeed the Six-Day War in 1967.
Indeed, the PLO was formed in 1964, if I'm not mistaken, even before Israel had acquired what we call Judea and Samaria and what other people generally know as the West Bank.
True, true. The PLO was established in Jerusalem on my birthday in 1964. I think it's a coincidence, though.
Nothing's a coincidence, Eyal. We are
So,
men of faith.
definitely so. So yeah, it was established in 1964, and in 1964 there was no so-called occupation. When the local Muslims, known as Palestinians, speak about the occupation of the land as the reason for the brutal terrorist actions, one indeed has to remember that these terrorist actions actually began with the formal way in 1964.
Yes.
But when we speak about Palestinian terror, or perhaps we shouldn't say Palestinian, because as I said, the term is anachronistic in a sense.
Indeed.
But when we speak about Islamic terror against the Jews in the Holy Land, one shouldn't stop at 1964, Marco. You should go back to 1936,
1929,
1929, 1921, 1854. I'm talking about a massacre of Jews, for instance, in 1929 in Hebron and in Tzfat. And I investigated a little bit the topic of the terror attack of the Muslims on Tzfat, the city in the Galilee, a mixed population city, having Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the beginning of the 20th century. And in 1929, the Arabs, the Muslims, attacked the Jewish population at Tzfat and other places too, and they brutally massacred the population. I've seen some of the pictures. It's beyond. It's inhumane. It's something which reminds to me today, after October the 7th.
The 7th, indeed.
It reminds me what we have seen, the atrocities the Palestinians committed on October 7th, 23. Well, there was actually something.
We have precedents. We have many precedents. We have many precedents.
In Hebron and so on. I've seen pictures of a woman which was nailed to the window frame and burnt alive in Tzfat.
Indeed.
Similar pictures. And I don't wish to go into details.
We don't need to go into the details. We leave that to the imagination of...
Absolutely.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
And nothing really compares to the atrocities that were committed a month ago.
Indeed.
But, so there were precedents to that.
There were abundant
and there was no state of Israel. There was no so-called occupation, and one cannot justify that in any way, but certainly not in this way.
Indeed, indeed. That I think many people will be enlightened by what you have said, and will see that what we are seeing now is nothing but a continuation of what we have seen over the past 150 years, and that's a conservative assessment of the situation. Eyal, I think we may have some questions. I'd like to give people an opportunity to ask questions. So if anybody has any questions, let's see whether they're going to fire them in. Okay, so if any of you have any questions for Dr. Meiron, he'd be most happy to answer them. I suggest you ask those questions in the chat option, which you will see on the bottom of the toolbar of the Zoom program. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to answer. Feel free to ask, rather. Okay, so Eyal, what Dr. Fogarollo is asking essentially is that history, to a great extent, certainly in the past 50 years, has been built upon mountains of lies and falsehoods. Okay, what can we do to address this problem? Of course, Dr. Fogarollo is very active in Italy. But do you have any suggestions about how we could improve our performance and enhance the historical understanding of the conflict here in the Middle East?
Well, thank you for the questions, Dr. Fogarollo. Let me say that I wish that this webinar was conducted 15 years ago and not today, because today it is very difficult to try to turn the wheel back. When we look at the so-called Palestinian side versus the Israeli side, we can clearly see that the supporters of the Palestinians did an excellent, unfortunately, from my perspective, horrible work during the last 2 decades or so in promoting the, as you said, the mountain of lies, the disinformation about the conflict in the Holy Land. And on the other side, and we can see that everywhere at universities, trade unions, the general public, the press in Europe and in the United States. And on the other side, on the Israeli part, we didn't see much work done. And that was, I think, due to the fact that many Israelis felt that words can't really harm us. We have the truth with us, and no one can distort it. However, as reality showed, indeed, it is very easy to distort the truth. And at this point, it's almost too late. But because I have faith, I hope that it isn't. And the only way to deal with that, I do not count on the Israeli authorities. In this respect, we are incompetent for different reasons. I think that the real work should be done by people like us, by people like you. And I'd like to say, really, hats off. I admire what you do, and I respect it so much, because I think that this is the only way to deal with evil, to deal with misinformation, and this is the ordinary people like us who can actually make the change. We have the power, and I think that what you're doing here is one of the first steps on that direction, and hopefully it will be continued. But we need to get to the universities, to the press, to the general public.
Grazie.
Today...
Grazie.
Yes, please.
Yes, I think you've actually answered the question that we have here from one of the participants. You've anticipated that answer.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's fine. I think that we have here. So
Grazie.
Yeah.
Io avrei un'altra domanda. Sì.
Okay, another question. Okay. Ok. Prego, domande?
Oh no.
Ah no, vedo... Ok, vedo
Sì.
una sì, sì, sì. Ok, vedo le domande qui. Ok. Why does I'm reading what's written in the chat here. Why does the world in general accept that so many Israeli people can be killed with impunity and then become indignant when Israel responds by trying to defeat the terrorists who perpetrated these horrendous crimes, even against poor innocent children?
It's a factual question. It is also a moral question, an ethical question. From the factual perspective, I think it's quite simple. Israel, let me rephrase it. Had it been just 1,500 Israelis butchered by the Palestinians, I think that would be very simple, and we would get all the sympathy in the world from the press, the general public, and the academy. No problem. The problem begins when Israelis stand for their lives, when they try to retaliate to protect themselves. And at that point, we see that we are being constantly criticized. Why does that happen? I think there are two reasons for that. One reason is the fact that Israel is conceived to be the strong side. And in the twisted, modern, progressive thinking of many people around the world, if you are the strong, you are by definition the unjust, the wrong.
Yes.
And the weak people, no matter what atrocities they commit, they are the good side.
Indeed.
So once you have this framework of mindset, it's so simple to interpret everything. So that's one component, I think. The other component is the fact that we are dealing with a monstrous enemy, not just because they butchered and they slaughtered Jews and they did what they did, but because these people couldn't care less about their own families, their own citizens, their own children. I've seen a picture of a Palestinian from Gaza holding his little boy, his baby, in his hands with explosives tied to him. How can a human being do such a thing? So in Gaza, the Hamas murderers are hiding in a hospital. They're taking the fuel from the hospital. They are standing behind their families, the young ones, the elderly.
Indeed.
It is extremely difficult to deal with such a threat. We need to destroy them. That is absolutely understood. But look at the price.
Indeed.
They are causing us to kill their own people, to kill their own families, and they couldn't care less.
Indeed. And let me just interrupt you there for a second. I think what you say, and the fact that this is accepted in the West, is we have seen a constant and steady demoralization of society. Hence, there is a lack of a proper moral frame of reference to which to defer. I have another question now. Do you think, this is from another participant, do you think the two-state solution is totally impossible right now?
I'm sorry, Marco, do I think?
Do you think the two-state solution, two-state option is totally impossible right now?
It's a very difficult question, not because the situation is complex, but because in my mind, as an academic, the situation is very simple. If one believes that the conflict between the so-called Palestinians and the Israelis is based on territory, then yes, the simple solution would be to give a state to the Palestinians, a state to the Israelis, and everything will be fine. But unfortunately, this is not the situation. It is actually the territorial description of the conflict is actually masking, deceiving, and creating a false impression. The Palestinians, and some of them from time to time, actually admit that. I mentioned Professor Edward Said, whom I like very much, because from time to time he actually tells the truth about the Palestinian intentions. And it is clearly understood that the Palestinians use this as a pretext, as an excuse for the destruction of any Jewish state in the Holy Land. Think about the motto, the slogan in the demonstrations outside, the pro-Palestinian demonstrations. One state from the river to the sea. Now, I do not have here in front of me the map of the Holy Land, but the sea is the Mediterranean Sea in the west. The river is the river Jordan. And in between, that should be the Palestinian state. It means there's no space for any future Israeli state. So, unfortunately, I believe that once we analyze the real intentions of the Palestinians, a two-state solution, unfortunately, I'd be happy to have it, but unfortunately, we do not have partners for that. We actually were willing to give them a state. May I remind you, in 1937, and they refused. In 1948, and they refused. In 2000, they could get 95% of the so-called Western Bank. They refused to that and turned to terror. In 2009, they refused to that. The state of Israel constantly tries to go this way. I think we shouldn't, but we did that. Yet the Palestinians saved us by refusing, because this is not, I believe, is not a real solution. They don't want a state. They simply don't want the Jews in the Holy Land.
Indeed, indeed. It is an eliminationist ideology, and I think it does nothing but mask a jihadi metaphysics. Let's get a little bit academic for a second. It is a jihadis cloaked in liberalism, and they've done a very good job at marketing their non-cause, may I say. So Dr. Fogorol is raising the point about tourist information with regard to Jerusalem being a holy city for the three monotheistic traditions. And of course, according to what we've learned this evening, the situation is very different. It is first and foremost holy to the Jews and then the Christians.
And then in
the Buddhists.
And then, yes, I think that the touristic approach of the Ministry of Tourism is not based on knowledge of history or knowledge of religion. It is based on good intentions to make everyone feel well, feel nice, cooperating. Unfortunately, this is indeed, as you've noted very well, it is not based on real history or real theology. So you were absolutely right. I agree.
Indeed, indeed.
Grazie, dottore.
Thank you. Oh,
hang on.
Grazie molte.
Hang on, we have one more question. Sorry, we can squeak in one more question. Abbiamo ancora una domanda. Siccome abbiamo... Okay, so here I'm going to read it out to you. Here the question is, Rabin and Arafat had reached an agreement. They were secular. Since then, positions have radicalized from a religious point of view on both sides. And this has contributed to distancing a possible peace agreement. What do you think of this analysis?
Well, I thank you again for the question. I definitely think that Rabin was a secular Jew. Yes, I agree to that. Was Yasser Arafat a secular Muslim? I'm not that certain. I believe that indeed the PLO presents itself as a modern movement in the spirit of socialism and the great movements of the 20th century. But in reality, we end up with people, and these people are definitely not disconnected from their religion and their religious beliefs. Actually, let me just give you an example. Arafat indeed had conducted the negotiations with the Israelis for more than a decade. He forged the Oslo agreements with Israel, and he was criticized on that by his fellows in the Palestinian side. In two occasions, Yasser Arafat, once in Johannesburg and the next one in Egypt, once in Arabic, I'm sure about that, he addressed the issue, and he said that the agreements with the Israelis are similar. I'm rephrasing what he said, because otherwise we need to get to deeper explanations. But the agreements with the Israelis are like the agreements conducted by the Prophet Muhammad 1,300 years ago with the pagans. They are temporary. And therefore, as did the Prophet, you may expect, Arafat already believed he will eventually undermine these agreements. So I don't think that he was sincere in signing these agreements, and I don't think that he was disconnected from his religious tradition. The issue here is to understand that there are people here in the Middle East who still think in terms of policies and politics which is 1,300 years old. Now, Judaism and Christianity have evolved since antiquity. Islam, in many respects, is still stuck, I believe. Not all Muslims, of course, but many Muslims, and definitely the Palestinians, are still stuck in the set of mind, in the mindset of the early Islamic period. And I think this may be part of the problem we're facing today. We're talking one language, the other side speaks a totally different language, and we, the Israelis, I think many of us, refuse to realize that, because if you realize that, you get despair, you get, it's horrible.
Indeed. Sorry, Eyal, just to close, I think people should bear in mind that Yasser Arafat starts his career in the Muslim Brotherhood. His intellectual, spiritual reference point is Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Clearly, that is difficult to market to a Western liberal audience. Hence, we see the birth of Fatah, which portrays itself at some stage as Che Guevara-like freedom fighters, yes, and sometimes as progressive liberals. But I think that the mask is slowly but surely being torn off.
I agree.
Anyway, I think we have run down our time. I would like to thank Dr. Eyal Meiron for his wonderful and erudite overview of events over the past 4,000 years in the space of an hour and a quarter, and he is to be commended for that. So thank you very much, dear friend, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you so much, Marco, and thank you so much, Dr. Fogarello, for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of my insights on the present situation here in the Holy Land. God bless you all.